This is the video portion of my final paper for the class seminar in leadership at West Texas A&M University. My paper is on Abraham Lincoln, and it starts with listing off a set of adversities he had gone through, such as the death of his mother at age 9, battling depression, having only 1 year of formal schooling, failed businesses, multiple lost elections, the death of his sister, the death of his son, and that was designed to pull the reader in, but also to illustrate some of the innate characteristics that Lincoln had that made him such a great leader, such as resilience, determination, and raw intelligence. He was able to teach himself to pass the bar and become a lawyer. But largely, the paper focuses on the leadership he demonstrated in the time of the Civil War and abolition of slavery, and in particular, transformational leadership, of which there are four major factors: idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. And I will touch on all four of those. At the age of 45, Lincoln is essentially a retired politician practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. He has only 2 years of national political experience under his belt, when in 1954, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act catapults him back into the political arena. Now, this piece of legislation would have potentially allowed slavery to extend into new states and territories, and Lincoln believed that this was in direct violation of the Missouri Compromise. So, in response, he plans a series of 3 speeches, of which the most famous is the 3-hour-long Peoria speech. And these speeches gained him a fair amount of national attention, especially amongst the up-and-coming Republican Party and the abolitionist movement. Lincoln would go on to lose an election for Senate in 1958, but ultimately win the nomination for presidency in 1960 for the Republican Party. Now, at this time, Lincoln is truly a moderate on the issue of slavery. He is not calling for abolition or even the freeing of any slaves. His main political objective is to prevent the expansion of slavery any further. And even though Lincoln is a moderate on the issue, the South sees him as a raging lunatic and starts seceding from the Union even before he takes office. Now, even after Lincoln does take office, he undoubtedly sees it as his primary goal to preserve the Union. And even well into the Civil War, when it's almost inevitable that the North is going to win, he's making concessions with the South, saying, like, if you surrender now, you can keep your slaves, or the idea of compensated emancipation, where the federal government would pay slave owners for the freedom of slaves. In my opinion, one of the problems is Lincoln thinks too much like a lawyer. I don't know if you've ever gotten into a debate with a lawyer, but it always starts out something like, technically in 1901, blah, 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 therefore, and you're just like, get me out of here. And so in thinking like a lawyer, Lincoln believes that the federal government essentially has no right to free slaves. And so, heck, why even try? And so the other thing to keep in mind is that Lincoln is truly a master politician. He's not only dealing with the Confederacy and trying to keep the Union together, but even within his own party and his own allies, there are factions that think the abolition of slavery is of the utmost importance, and others that think that the war is worth fighting to keep the Union together, but they could care less about slaves. So no matter what Lincoln does, he's going to upset somebody, and he really does do a masterful job of walking fine line between all these competing interests. In my opinion, he truly starts to demonstrate transformational leadership when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He did this on January 1st, 1863, and it was very controversial at the time. Much of his cabinet and closest advisors were advising him not to do this. And it's even controversial today because it was essentially a wartime act, an executive order which only freed slaves within states of rebellion. Now, going back to Lincoln as the lawyer, he doesn't see that he has the power to free any slaves, but he does have the power under the Constitution to to issue an act during wartime in order to suppress said rebellion, and that's why he limits the freedom of slaves to the rebellious states. Now, even though the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't appear to have very much to do with civil rights or the freedom of slaves on the surface, it really does set the stage for everything that is to come. And so Lincoln demonstrates idealized influence in crafting the Emancipation Proclamation by tying it to a higher moral cause and even saying that he has a covenant with God to do this. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation, by issuing it, it's tying the abolition of slavery to a cause of the war, which was strategically important for various reasons. Lincoln also demonstrates intellectual stimulation just in the sheer brain power to come up with this thing and to weave it within the confines of the Constitution. And indeed, the Emancipation Proclamation never does get challenged or struck down by a court of law. So it was obviously a very creative and innovative solution to the current problem that he was facing. Now, my favorite part of this story is on November 19th, 1863, when he delivers the Gettysburg Address. Now, this is for the dedication of a national cemetery at a Civil War battlefield. And at this time, the nation is growing very tired of the Civil War. And Lincoln sees and recognizes this as a transformative opportunity. The ironic thing is that Lincoln was almost an afterthought in the whole thing. The keynote speaker was actually named Edwin Everett. He was a former president of Harvard and one of the greatest orators of the time. Now, Everett was busy crafting a 2-hour-long speech, which he was going to deliver by memory. So he needed some extra time, and during that delay, Lincoln was invited to speak. Now imagine this. Everett gets up there and gives a 2-hour speech from memory, and then the President of the United States steps up to the podium and delivers a 2-minute speech. Now, undoubtedly, that was 2 of the most impactful minutes in history, but the crowd didn't realize it at the time. And of course, it starts 77 years ago, and he's referring to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In the end, he goes on to plea with the people not to let the dead die in vain, and that this country should have a new birth of freedom, and that a government of the people, for the people, and by the people shall not perish from this earth. He does an amazing thing here. He says that the Declaration of Independence is what defines the ideals of our country. At that time, everyone thought the Constitution was the end-all, be-all, what defined the ideals and the laws of the country. And Lincoln says, no, wait. If it wasn't for the Declaration, we would have never fought that war, and we would not be here today as a country. And in that vein, he not only ties the abolition of slavery to a cause of the war, but he steps up the game, and he's now saying that civil liberties are one of the reasons that we're fighting the war. The second thing he does is reinvigorates the country's resolve to keep fighting and to win the war. And the third thing is that he demonstrates an unbelievable amount of humility. He basically says, yeah, it's great that we're all gathered here today to do this nice thing. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. And he goes on further to say, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Now, forget for a second that when I say Gettysburg, you think Gettysburg Address, and that this becomes one of the most famous speeches in world history. The President of the United States is speaking here, and he's basically saying, my presence here is minuscule, means almost nothing comparatively, and that you will not remember, the world will not remember what I am saying, but it will never forget what my men did. And that is inspirational leadership at its finest. Now, the war is coming to a close, and Lincoln is definitely worried that the Emancipation Proclamation won't stand. But he's still very lukewarm about a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. He sees it as politically risky, and he's got a re-election campaign. However, the Republican Party includes it as one of the issues on their party platform for the election of 1864. And so after Lincoln gets reelected, he truly puts everything he has into this. I mean, and it likely would not have passed without the influence of Abraham Lincoln. He definitely demonstrates individualized consideration in pulling out every personal relationship that he has, listening to other politicians and understanding where they're coming from and what they need out of the deal. And he even goes way further than that. He goes pure Machiavellianism. He tells his closest advisors and cabinet to procure the necessary votes by any means necessary. And that even included a fund of money for the direct bribes of politicians. So do the ends justify the means in this case? I mean, we would all have to think that they do. But that's just another fascinating portion of the Lincoln story. So in summary, Lincoln, if he could be considered, if he could be criticized for anything, it would be that he didn't act fast enough or with an iron fist once he actually did have the power of the most powerful office in the world. But I'll leave it to the words of Frederick Douglass, memorializing him in 1876. He starts off by naming Lincoln's faults, but he ends by saying, taking him for all in all, measuring the tremendous magnitude of the work before him, considering the necessary means to the end, and surveying the end from the beginning. Infinite wisdom has seldom sent any man into the world better fitted for this mission than Abraham Lincoln. So, in the end, Lincoln, essentially, he dies for recommending suffrage rights for blacks. And it was a cause that he was well aware that he could die for, and a cause that he was well willing to die